Let's start soon. If we don't get back, we'll get caught. Don't worry, Alexander. No one suspects anything about us. That's true. Once I get married, it'll be harder to meet, so let's take our time and enjoy today. On the eve of the wedding, I was at my in-laws' house, having a meal with 15 family members. During that time, I was secretly watching Alexander's behavior. For your information, Alexander is my fiancé and future husband, and Sandra is my sister. He sneaked out of the house, so I followed him quietly and started tailing him. Alexander headed to a nearby apartment building. It was the apartment where Alexander and I were living together. After making sure Alexander entered the apartment, I checked my smartphone and could hear him talking with my sister up to this moment. I know everything. I have prepared to bring down Alexander and my sister to hell. It's all over for you. Holding my smartphone in front of the apartment, I muttered quietly to myself. Several hours later, Alexander and my sister returned to the in-laws' house. We're back. Man, we're so late. Everyone gathered at the in-laws, including me, looked at them with disapproval. There were my sister's husband Tony, and Alexander's, and my parents. Is there any food left? Man, I was called out due to trouble with a client. It was so busy, no time to rest. Alexander and I rushed in, and thankfully, it settled down, but it was really tough. We're starving. As Alexander and my sister were settling down, trying to explain how busy they had been, they tried to take their seats. Just as they sat down, I started the conversation. Alexander, I'm sorry to bring this up suddenly, but let's cancel the wedding. What did you just say? I mean, I can't marry you. Hey, what are you saying in front of everyone? Tomorrow is our wedding day. That's right, Rita. Why don't you calm down? Suddenly, when I proposed breaking off the engagement, Alexander and my sister started making a fuss, and at that moment, my sister's husband Tony handed her a piece of paper. Sandra, I'm divorcing you too. Sign this now. What are you talking about, Tony? The two, completely clueless, were flustered. The why were clearly confused. It's rude to joke like this in front of everyone who gathered for us. Keep the jokes to a minimum. Or are you angry? As I said, I was called out by the company, so it can't be helped. That's right, Tony. We've been doing well, haven't we? This joke isn't funny. We've been doing well? Rude in front of everyone? I don't want to hear that from you too. Both of you have been cheating. What are you talking about? What are you talking about? I haven't done anything like that. You're making false accusations. The two, caught red-handed, showed contrasting reactions. My sister began to redden and grow angry. On the other hand, Alexander twisted his face and then sighed deeply. Look, Rita. Don't you realize you're saying something odd? You know I've been busy with work and business trips, right? So busy that I sometimes can't even make it to the wedding planning meetings. I don't have time to cheat. Alexander seemed intent on playing innocent. When blamed for a fault, he would shift the blame onto others. I had only recently discovered this habit of Alexander's. So, you're both saying you were late just because of work? Of course. We wouldn't lie at a time like this. We both hold responsible positions, after all. Did Alexander and my sister think they had managed a convincing excuse? They both nodded in agreement. My sister and Alexander worked in the same department at the same company. So, their claim about being busy with work wasn't necessarily inconsistent. As Alexander had mentioned earlier, ever since our wedding was decided, he had been extremely busy. He was appointed as a project leader, which meant his overtime and weekend work had significantly increased. Furthermore, he had repeatedly canceled wedding planning meetings due to suddenly important business negotiations. Yet, it was Alexander who initially insisted on having a grand wedding. But his enthusiasm only lasted until the first meeting with the planner. Gradually, everything was left up to me. I'm sorry for being late to the important dinner. It took longer than expected. But from now on, it'll be okay. You know we're doing important work, right? What exactly was going to be okay? Alexander was confident without any basis. He probably thought he could easily talk his way out of this. As the conversation went on quietly, my father-in-law spoke up. So you really went to work then? That's what I've been saying, haven't I? Whether you went to work or not, are you really sure about that? Repeating my father-in-law's words, I brought out a camera I had hidden in another room. This room had a large TV where everyone could see. I connected the camera to the TV and played the recording. Let's start soon. If we don't get back, we'll get caught. Don't worry, Alexander. No one suspects anything about us. That's true. Once I get married, it'll be harder to meet, so let's enjoy today slowly. The video was the same one I had been watching on my smartphone a few hours earlier while tailing Alexander and my sister. Actually, I've been watching your actions all day with this pet camera. Quite a mess, isn't it? Alexander and my sister, just having seen their earlier actions, were stunned. Why is this being recorded? I had always wanted to own a cat since I was young. Unfortunately, it turned out my father was allergic to cats, so it was impossible to have one at home. So, that's why I thought about getting a cat in the apartment where we live now. When I discussed it with Alexander, he seemed indifferent and just said, "Do whatever you want." I happen to know someone who fosters cats, and they arranged to give me a newborn kitten next month. For now, I had prepared everything perfectly, including a cat cage, a food container, a toilet, and even a pet camera to check on things when I'm not home. Oh, Alexander didn't know about it, did you? You have always been all about work. You hardly ever stayed home. I just set up the camera recently. I thought you would notice something as obvious as the pet camera being installed. Tony, who is not good with gadgets, bought and helped me install the camera instead of me. I had told him beforehand, yet he was too preoccupied to listen. Were you just too caught up in work, or should I say, the affair, to notice? At first, my parents and in-laws seemed puzzled. But as they listened to our exchange and saw the evidence, they clearly expressed their anger. To think that those who were about to become relatives were cheating. And it was revealed right in front of the whole family. With wedding coming up, what are you two doing? What a thing to happen. I'm ashamed even though you're my own children. Rita, I'm truly sorry. My parents' and in-laws' expressions rapidly changed from anger at Alexander and my sister to apologize to me and Tony. It's not something you should apologize for, I thought, as I looked at Alexander and the others. I guess you can't talk your way out of this one, I said, forcing a slight smile. Perhaps displeased by my demeanor, Alexander's face twisted, and he suddenly started making excuses. Enough already. The project's been tough, and the colleagues are useless, so I had no choice but to work overtime and on weekends. Coming home late like this and Rita doesn't even care, just keeps talking about the wedding, it was just adding to the pressure. It was, what you call, pre-wedding blues. It's your fault for not noticing how tired I am, he implied, once again blaming others for his problems. Once again, Alexander deflected blame onto others while absolving himself. Rita has always been clueless, you know. Alexander even complained about it at work. He didn't want to come home. But Sandra, on the other hand, is kind and considerate. I guess the devil got into me. It's inevitable, right? They say cheating is a man's nature, and you won't make a good wife if you fuss over this. My sister ridiculed me with a laugh. Alexander spoke in a tone as if he had resigned himself to his fate. Seeing the attitudes of the two, my anger grew. After all, it was my sister who had introduced me to Alexander. She had told me about a single colleague who might be a good match and introduced Alexander to me. My first impression of Alexander was that he was serious and had a gentle demeanor. He might have been a bit careless with time and attire, but he was someone who would take the lead. But the Alexander before me now had none of those traits. It was my in-laws who showed more anger than I did at this point. You kids, they almost leaped at Alexander and my sister. But Alexander and my sister smoothly dodged and continued to laugh flippantly. Even in this situation, the two of them showed their composure. I sighed as I looked at them. I knew they were lying about something else. By the way, when I was going to wash Alexander's jacket and checked the pockets, I found this. I pulled a piece of paper from the pocket. Everyone, you understand what I'm trying to say with this, right? The relatives stared at the paper I was holding. Everyone seemed to catch on quickly, tilting their heads and murmuring, "Huh? Alexander, weren't you busy with work? You said you were working overtime and even on weekends every day, right?" What I had pulled out was Alexander's most recent pay stub. Despite his claims of frequent overtime and weekend work, only about 5 hours were recorded as overtime. Normally, you'd think that was just enough to handle some tasks at the beginning and end of the month. Doing overtime every day, and this is all the overtime hours you have? That doesn't add up, does it? Then Alexander made an unbelievable excuse. Look, if you've been following the news, you'd know. There's no company that pays out all the overtime these days because of the recession. Don't underestimate the life of a salaried worker. So, you're saying your company is exploitative company? Well, indeed, my job is not that of a salaried worker. I work as a freelancer from home. Originally, I also worked at a company, but at Alexander's strong insistence, he said, I might be too busy to help much at home, so I'd prefer if you could work from home and take care of the housework too. But that's not the issue here. I decided to bring out new evidence. I tossed a thick envelope. Take a look inside, will you? As Alexander and my sister looked inside the envelope, their faces gradually turned pale. Inside were numerous photos of Alexander and my sister meeting up. Pictures of them arm in arm entering a hotel in a bustling district. There were also photos of them embracing in front of my sister's house. Did they really think they could be so blatant and not get caught? The sudden increase in your overtime and weekend work, and the timing of your cancellations of the wedding preparations were too coincidental. That's why I secretly checked when Alexander finished work and followed him. You were supposed to be working at night or doing housework, right? You skipped that to stalk me? That's low. What are you, a stalker? Who's the lowest here? Plus, I'm not dumb enough to let my fiancé run wild. By the way, I didn't do this alone, okay? What do you mean? Alexander answered irritably. I glanced at Tony. No way. Tony also started suspecting something when my sister began coming home late. Tony and I alternated tracking where Alexander went after work. It turned out that all the days he claimed to have overtime, weekend work, or business trips, he was actually meeting with my sister. And yes, on the days he canceled attending the wedding preparations, he was meeting her as well. Just to be sure, I even called the department at the company where Alexander and my sister work. Here's what I was told during that call. The whole company has been reducing overtime and weekend work due to work reform policies. Business trips are very rare at this company. There shouldn't have been any orders for Alexander. That's good to know. Thank you. The amount of work in their department is pretty much fixed, and overtime is only necessary at the beginning and end of the month. Also, the story about Alexander being appointed as a project leader turned out to be a complete lie. You were just shoved into a back office at work because of your bad conduct, right? Well, that aside, the pet camera I installed came in handy. It caught your affair on tape perfectly. Trying to go through with the wedding and expecting Tony to continue the marriage under these circumstances is absurd. But just calling off the engagement or getting a divorce isn't enough for Tony and me, so we decided to get our revenge right here in front of everyone. Cornered with no way out, Alexander and Sandra were gritting their teeth. The relatives were visibly angry about their deceit and their reluctance to admit to the affair despite pretending to be busy with work. They crowded around, hurling insults. While Rita has been diligently working and doing household chores, what in the world were you two thinking? Sandra, I'm so disappointed. You used to be so reliable, especially having someone wonderful like Tony. You pride yourself on your work, and Tony showed understanding by not minding your supposed work commitments, and you betray him like this, you foolish girl." Feeling overwhelmed by their parents' fierce demeanor, Alexander and Sandra both knelt down, touching their hands and faces to the floor, saying, "We're truly, truly sorry." They stayed down without raising their faces for a while, but either way, Tony and I had no intention of forgiving them. "Look, Rita, as I said before, this was all just a fling. You know how people sometimes want to have a bit of fun before getting married, right? It happens all the time in TV shows. So, once we're married, I'll be all yours. So, no calling off the engagement, please. I'm begging you." "That's right." Alexander was just being pitiful, and I was just lending an ear as a colleague. Since we'll be family, I couldn't just dismiss him. "So please, Tony, not a divorce." Everyone else could only sigh in disbelief at their audacity. If apologizing were enough, we wouldn't need police or laws. "You two have acted shamefully, and I won't forgive you for anything. And Alexander, you're hiding something else, aren't you?" "What am I hiding?" The room started buzzing with whispers. "What? There's more?" Everyone looked restless. Had Alexander admitted his faults from the start and shown a sincere apology, I might have been torn. But that wasn't the case. His behavior was filled with ugly evasion, excuses, and shifting the blame. I resolved to corner Alexander completely here. "Sorry, there was one last thing left." I waved another document in the air. My sister snatched it from my hands. "What now?" "We haven't done anything beyond what you know." "What is this, Alexander?" Her demeanor changed drastically from the one in the video. She confronted Alexander furiously. "All this time, you've been telling me there's only me for you. What is this?" Let me see." Alexander started trembling as he read the paper. The paper in Alexander and Sandra's hands was a detective's investigation report. Alexander had also been making moves on a female staff member at the wedding planners. I recall how during our first meeting, Alexander was unusually chatty with her. I was too naive to think he was just being enthusiastic. Thinking back, he must have harbored inappropriate thoughts towards her. Using the excuse that she was an important client and couldn't be offended, Alexander forcefully pursued her. Claiming to have an important matter, he would call her out over the phone, and once alone, he pressured her into a relationship. With the wedding approaching, you'd think we'd be having more in-depth discussions more often. But then the planner started acting distant and stopped showing up for meetings. When I investigated her situation along with the planners, it was utterly damning. Having an affair with my sister was shocking enough, but going after the planner too was beyond the pale. Most of the relatives had expressions of disgust, unable to listen any longer. In the midst of it all, someone kicked Alexander with tremendous force. "You, how dare you deceive me like this? Don't mess with me. Ouch!" Sandra, seizing the opportunity after the kick, repeatedly punched Alexander in the face. Sandra has always been strong. During her school days, she even won a karate competition at the state level. It's a shame to see such strength wasted in such a foolish way. "What you did counts as domestic violence. I'm going to sue you, you violent, hysterical woman. Cheating and you're talking about suing? That's rich." Despite his bold words, Alexander isn't suited for rough situations. He's notoriously unathletic. Yet, Alexander attempted to fight back. Though he couldn't overpower her, he pulled at Sandra's blouse and hair. Within minutes, both looked utterly disheveled. "It's that moody nature of yours I hate. You snap at anything you don't like. And you're always whining, even though you're a man." Despite both having cheated, they continued to blame each other, making a noisy scene. The ridiculousness of their fight almost made me laugh. Just when the fight seemed to be settling down, Alexander made a terrifying excuse. "Look, it was going to be tough to keep things up with Sandra once I married Rita. That's why I wanted to keep the planner on the side. What? Just earlier, he had been claiming he'd be devoted to Rita once they were married. His true feelings had slipped out. It seems he was planning to cheat repeatedly. What an incorrigible fool. As I thought about proceeding with the divorce, Sandra was trying to cozy up to Tony. See? You understand now, right? I was deceived too. Tony, you'll give us another chance, right? Tony, red-faced with anger, pushed her away. So, I'm not a victim because I was cheated on? Cheating is cheating, even if you were deceived. How can I forgive you after causing such a commotion? Naturally, the relatives looked on with cold eyes. Tony simply said, I will never forgive you, and glared fiercely at Alexander and Sandra one last time. Oh, and by the way, Alexander, you're paying the full cancellation fee for the venue. Shouldn't we split it? Whose fault do you think this is? Remember, I was the one who said I'd pay for the wedding expenses before we got married. You wouldn't listen and didn't pay a dime, so I covered it all. That's not enough. I'll also be taking compensation. Damn, I should have never cheated in the first place. Beside him, Sandra was sobbing. Oh, right. I've already discussed this with your company, so expect a call from them soon. It was a long day, but my engagement with Alexander was definitely off. Sandra and Tony's divorce was, of course, inevitable. With the evidence and photos I had gathered through a detective, everything proceeded smoothly. In the aftermath, Sandra was disowned by my parents, and Alexander was cut off by my in-laws, naturally. As I mentioned earlier, Tony and I had already reported their actions to the company. Originally, both were already poorly regarded at work, and the affair scandal didn't help, leaving Alexander without a place there. Unable to bear it, Alexander quit voluntarily, but re-employment has been difficult since he's nearly 40 and hadn't been doing any significant work before. Worse still, he's being sued for compensation by the husband of the wedding planner he harassed. Alexander knew she was married. And even blackmailed her, saying, "You don't want your husband to find out, do you?" This situation has even involved the police. Now, Alexander is taking multiple part-time jobs from dawn till dusk, trying to pay both the compensation and the cancellation fees for the wedding. He literally has no time to mess around with women anymore. Months after the divorce, Alexander started calling me multiple times a day. I didn't want to hear his voice, but he was so persistent that I decided to confront him just once. I need you, Rita. I won't cheat again, please, let's start over. His crying almost swayed me. But I decided to make my last remark snide. Why don't you just stay with my favorite sister, Sandra? At that, Alexander broke down even more. No. I want nothing to do with her anymore. She's gotten crazy lately. Alexander then shakily began to explain recent events about Sandra. She's been in trouble with the police for stalking. Stalking? She's been picked up by the police for stalking. She's been showing up at every job I take. Fighting so much and now this, it's almost funny. Don't mock me. She's become isolated at work or something and is obsessively clinging to me now. She calls me dozens of times a day. I never thought she'd be such a creepy old lady. I'm done with her for good. That's not possible. Why not? Sandra has always had a clingy streak. Once she starts, she doesn't listen to anyone. You knew about this situation and still listened? Yes. Didn't I tell you I have a relative in the police? They were the ones who restrained Sandra. It was one of my cousin's subordinates, so I knew right away. If that's the case, help me out sooner. There's no reason for me to help. Oh, by the way, Sandra mentioned during her interrogation that she will never forgive Alexander, and she plans to follow him forever. She hasn't forgiven him for deceiving her and intends to stick to him for life. You're lying. Come on, weren't we almost family? You know, they say spouses should help each other. I don't know. You two were the ones who cheated and got together, so maybe you should just get along? No one will bother you. How nice for you. Suddenly, I heard loud knocking in the background.
She's come to my house now. Help me, hey.
Chuckling, I quietly hung up the phone. Once, I genuinely wanted to marry Alexander. Now, that thought seems unbelievable. Once I started doubting and investigating, the extent of Alexander's failings came to light one after another. I feel truly relieved that I discovered everything before we got married. My parents have completely disowned Sandra. After discussing with my parents, we secretly moved to the countryside to live with distant relatives, without letting Sandra know. It was sad to leave friends and colleagues behind, but if moving helps me forget the incidents with Alexander and Sandra, then it's worth it. The relatives in the countryside, who were aware of the whole affair, welcomed us warmly. I had always lived in the city, so I was worried about adapting to country life, but as the old saying goes, you'll love wherever you live. Due to a shortage of workers, I was offered a job as a clerk at the local agricultural cooperative. On my days off, I sometimes help out in the relatives' fields. Everyone at work and the locals are very kind, and we help each other out in many ways. Maybe it's because I'm outside more, or perhaps it's because I've successfully distanced myself from Alexander, but I feel healthier than before. Even several months after moving to the countryside, Alexander continued to send me messages begging for help. He's trapped in a life where he can't escape from Sandra due to his own actions. He seems to be quite cornered, but that's none of my concern. I blocked his contact immediately because I didn't want my peaceful life to be disturbed. As for Tony, we've kept in touch even after moving away from the city. Though he hasn't moved far, he relocated his home to keep it secret. I called Tony to thank him again. Tony, thank you so much for your help back then. Thanks to you, I'm now living happily at my relative's home. No, I should be the one thanking you. I'm sorry to speak ill of your sister, but I'm relieved to be away from such a terrible woman. Tony seemed brighter than before when we talked over the phone. I'm enjoying my work now. I'm definitely off marriage for a while. I feel the same way. But if the countryside is that nice, I might visit sometime. Please do. Let me know when you're coming. I thought it was just a polite offer, but once his work settled down, Tony actually came to visit. And that's how Tony ended up liking the countryside and eventually deciding to live here with me, but that's a story for another time.